On a cold Thursday morning, 3 days after Christmas in the winter of 1882, roughly 100 people walked into a stone mill in Bradford and stopped for breakfast. Most of them were women. Many of them were girls. 20 of them were children under the age of 15. Within the space of a single minute, 54 of them were dead. There was no fire. There was no explosion. There was no flood, no boiler burst, no act of God that anyone could point to and call it fate. What fell on Newlands Mill that morning was a chimney. 255 feet of quarried stone, close to 4,000 tons of it, standing above the weaving sheds, like a monument to the town's own wealth. It came down across the roofs in a matter of seconds and buried 400 square yards of the works beneath it. And here is the part that should never be allowed to fade. That chimney did not fall out of a clear sky. It had been cracking for the better part of 20 years. People had watched it lean. They had watched it sway in the wind. They had hired men to climb it and patch it and drive iron into it again and again since the year it was built. In the weeks before it fell, stone and lime dropped from it into the yard on a regular basis. A bulge had opened on one face of it, halfway up, plain enough to see from the street. And 8 days before the collapse, a man had put it in writing that the damaged section would be forced out before the end of the week. The mill kept running anyway. This is the story of how a structure that everyone had watched crack for 2 decades was allowed to keep working over the heads of 100 people, and of what happened on the morning it finally gave way. It is the story of a coroner's jury that heard all of this, every warning and every letter, and returned a verdict that attached no blame to anyone at all. And it is the story of how a nation that read about it in the newspapers came slowly to decide that this could never be called an accident again. To understand how an ordinary chimney over an ordinary mill became one of the worst structural disasters in Victorian England, you have to go back to the town that built it, and to the people who lived and worked in its shadow. Before we go on, this channel is only just getting started, so if these forgotten corners of Victorian Britain are the kind of history that stays with you, take a moment to subscribe, and a like genuinely helps these stories reach more people. And leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're watching from. I always like to see how far these stories travel. To understand what happened at Newlands Mill, you first have to understand what Bradford was. In the second half of the 19th century, this was one of the richest and busiest manufacturing towns on earth. It was the world capital of the worsted trade, the fine combed wool that was spun and woven into cloth and sold across every continent the British Empire touched. People called the place Worstedopolis, half in pride and half in grim acknowledgement of what all that industry had done to the air. It was a town of stone mills and packed terraces, of chimneys by the hundred, and of a sky that was rarely truly clear. Soot settled on everything. The buildings that had gone up bright and pale in local sandstone were black within a few years of being finished. On the south side of the town lay Bowling, a dense industrial quarter of workshops, dye works, and rows of workers' housing. The streets had names that told you something about the age and its reach, its confidence and its markets. Calcutta Street, Caledonia Street, Parsonage Road, King Charles Street. These were ordinary streets full of ordinary families, and most of those families had someone in the mills. Work began early and ended late. Children worked too. Many of them were what the era called half-timers, splitting the day between the mill and the schoolroom, earning a few shillings a week to add to what their parents brought home. A girl of 12 or 13 might bring in 3 shillings and sixpence, a boy a little more, and every coin mattered in a household where the rent came due whatever the week had held. This corner of Bradford belonged, in almost every sense that counted, to one family. The Ripleys. Sir Henry Ripley was a dyer by trade and a Conservative Member of Parliament by ambition, and by the 1880s he was one of the most celebrated men in the town. He had built Ripleyville, a model village of decent housing for working people, at a time when most of his fellow industrialists were content to let their workers crowd into whatever they could find. He gave to schools and to churches. He was, by the standards his own class set for itself, a benefactor. In 1882, the same year this story turns on, he handed a golden key to the Prince of Wales so that the future king might formally open a new technical college in the town. To the people of Bowling, the name Ripley meant wages, housing, and a certain civic grandeur. It was a name attached to good works. Remember that, because it matters to everything that came after. The mill that fell was not owned by some faceless fly-by-night operator. It stood at the centre of an estate built by a man the town had learned to admire. When the accounting finally came, it would come against one of Bradford's most respected families, and that made the reckoning both harder to demand and easier, in the end, to soften. Newland's mill itself sat on Upper Castle Street, part of the sprawling Ripley manufacturing estate. It was not run by a single firm, but let out in parts to several. A. Haley and Company were there. So were W. H. Greenwood and Company, and J. Horsfall and Company. Between them they filled the sheds with the ordinary texture of the Victorian workforce, women and girls and boys bent over frames and looms, the noise of the machinery so constant that people who worked in the trade learned to read one another's lips. The workers walked in from the surrounding streets each morning in the dark of a Yorkshire winter, and they walked home again in the dark, and in between they gave the mill their days. Among them that winter was a girl named Susanna Wright. She was 16, and she lived on Calcutta Street. There was nothing about her that would have set her apart from 1,000 other girls in Bowling. She got up before dawn, she went to the mill, she did her work. Keep her in mind because, on the morning this story turns on, a small and entirely forgettable thing, the kind of thing that happens to everyone, would decide whether she lived or died. And there was a widow named Sarah Hancock, and her son, James Henry, who was 13 years old. The Hancocks were exactly the sort of family the mills were built on, a mother without a husband to provide, and a child old enough to earn. James Henry worked at Newlands. His few shillings a week were part of what kept the household together. His name too is one to carry forward, because of something that was later said about that particular morning, and about a boy who did not want to go to work. That was the world. A town grown rich on wool and grey with its own smoke, a district of narrow streets and long hours, families held together by the wages of women and children, and over all of it the towering good name of the Ripleys. It was ordinary. It was, in its way, even hopeful, a place where a technical college was opening, and a model village stood as proof that things could be done decently. And running up out of the middle of it, taller than almost anything else for miles, was the chimney. To understand why that chimney fell, you have to go back to the day it was raised, because it was wrong almost from the first course of stone. A mill chimney in Victorian Bradford was not a decoration. It was the beating heart of the works. The great steam engines that drove the machinery burned coal, and the taller the chimney, the stronger the draught it pulled through the furnaces, and the harder the engines could work. Height was money. A high chimney meant more power, more looms turning, more cloth sold. So when Newland's mill was built in the early 1860s, the ambition was for something exceptional. The original design called for a stack of around 100 yards, 300 feet, which would have made it one of the tallest industrial chimneys in the entire district. It was never going to be able to stand. The trouble began underground, where no one looking up at the finished chimney would ever see it. The site chosen for the mill sat over an old pit, an abandoned coal shaft in a district that had been mined for generations. To build on such ground, the shaft was filled in, packed with stones and timber wedges and a cement mix, and the foundations laid over the top. But filled ground is not solid ground. In a mined district where the earth itself had been hollowed out below, the risk of subsidence, of the ground slowly settling and shifting beneath a great weight, was not a distant theory. It was a live and obvious danger, and onto that made-up ground, the builders proposed to raise one of the tallest stone chimneys in Yorkshire. The foundations could not bear the original plan, so the height was cut back, down to 255 feet. That decision sounds prudent, a sensible reduction in the face of weak ground. But it was not enough. Even at 255 feet, the chimney was, by the reckoning of those who studied it afterwards, far taller than that ground could safely carry, perhaps 90 feet taller than prudence allowed. They had recognised the danger and then only half answered it. They took some of the risk away and left the rest standing. The way the chimney was built made a bad situation worse. A sound stone chimney of that height ought to have been raised, as something close to a solid mass its strength carried all the way through. Newlands was not built that way. It was a shell of dressed stone on the outside, with a lining of brick within, and between the two, loose rubble packed in as backing. Picture the difference between a solid oak post and a hollow tube with gravel poured down the middle of it. The one holds together as a single thing. The other has an outer face that can peel and separate from its core because nothing truly binds them into one. That separation, the outer shell parting from the inner lining, was the precise way this chimney would one day fail. The flaw was designed in. It only needed 20 years and a hard enough wind to find it. And there was a third thing, a warning written into the very stone during construction, for anyone who cared to read it. When the chimney had reached around 70 feet, still years from finished, the builders found that it was not true. It was leaning, out of vertical by close to a metre. A chimney that leans a metre at 70 feet is a chimney telling you that something beneath it is not right. The honest response would have been to stop, to take it down, to examine the ground. That is not what happened. Instead, the builders cut out a course of stone on one side and drove iron wedges into the gap to force the leaning stack back upright. Think about what that means. They did not fix the cause. They shoved the symptom back into line and carried on building on top of it. That course of driven iron left a permanent line of weakness running through the structure, a scar built into it before it was even complete. A Manchester steeplejack named James Woodman was consulted about the bulge in those early days, and still the work went on. The chimney was finished around 1863, tall and proud and black streaked like all the rest, and from the ground it looked like a triumph. It was, in truth, a structure that had already announced its own weakness twice over, in the ground it stood on, and in the way it had been forced upright, before it ever carried its first full load. Now hold those three facts together, because they are the whole engine of what followed. Made ground over an old mine shaft, a shell that could separate from its core, and a lean, corrected with iron rather than cured. Any one of them might have been survivable. Together they were a countdown, and the clock had already started. It did not take long to begin ticking audibly. In 1865, only about 2 years after the chimney was completed, cracks appeared in it. Repairs were made, the damage patched, and the mill went on. That was the first time the structure was seen to be failing, and the response set the pattern for everything to come. The problem was treated as a thing to be mended rather than a warning to be obeyed. Patch it and keep the engines turning. 8 years later, in 1873, it happened again. Fresh cracks opened in the stack. Steeplejacks were hired once more to go up and make good the damage. Again the mill did not stop. Again the chimney was patched and returned to service. By now a pattern of roughly a decade between visible failures had established itself. And each time the men who owned and ran the works chose the same answer. There was always a repair to be made, and always a reason to keep the mill in production while it was made. Then came the autumn and winter of 1882, and this time the warnings were of an altogether different order. The high winds that swept in off the Pennines that season set the chimney visibly swaying. Not the barely perceptible flex that any tall structure makes in a gale, but a movement people could see with their own eyes from the ground below. Large cracks opened in the stonework. Stone and lime debris began to come away and fall regularly into the yard. Not once in a while, but as a matter of routine, so that the ground at the foot of the stack was littered with the evidence of its decay. And on the southeast face, roughly midway up, a bulge had formed, a swelling in the line of the stone where the outer shell was beginning to push away from what lay behind it. That bulge was the floor of 1863 coming due. The shell was separating from the lining exactly as the manner of its building had always allowed it to. Anyone who understood chimneys and looked closely at that face would have been looking at a structure in the process of coming apart. And people did look. A few days before Christmas, experts were brought in to inspect the stack. They climbed it, they examined the damage, and they found what was there to be found. The outer shell parting from the inner lining, the cracks, the bulge. Here was the moment when the whole thing might still have been stopped. A clear-eyed inspection, days before the collapse, by men brought in precisely because there was concern. And the judgment they returned was that the situation, while it needed attention, was not urgent. Scaffolding was put up around the damaged section so that it could be repaired over the holiday period, while the mill was closed and quiet. The repair was treated as maintenance to be fitted around the working calendar, not as an emergency that made the ground beneath it unsafe to stand on. To be fair to the difficulty of the moment, no one climbing that chimney could give an exact hour at which it would fall, but that is precisely the point that the age had not yet learned. You do not need to know the hour. You need only to know that a structure is failing and that people are working beneath it, and those two facts together are enough to empty the building. That knowledge existed, it simply was not acted upon. And then came the letter, and with the letter, the story stops being one of misjudgment and becomes something harder to forgive. On the 20th of December, 1882, the mill's agent, a man named Francis Haley, sat down and wrote to Henry Ripley, the son of the family that owned the works. Haley was not passing on a vague worry. He was relaying the specific opinion of a builder named Humphreys, one of the men who knew the structure. And Humphreys had been precise. The damaged portion of the chimney, he said, a section 4 or 5 yards in length, would be forced out before the end of the week. That is the language. Not might weaken, not could become dangerous, would be forced out, and soon. Put yourself in possession of that letter. You are being told in writing by a builder who has examined the structure that a piece of your chimney several yards long is going to be pushed out of the wall within days. Below that chimney, 100 people come to work each morning. There is only one response that letter can honestly command, and it is to keep those 100 people out from under it until the danger is gone. Stop the mill. Lose the production. Send the workers home on pay if you must, but do not let them stand beneath it. That is not what was decided. The response to the warning was to advise that people be kept from walking near the base of the chimney. Keep them from the foot of it and let the mill run. The engines would still turn, the looms would still work, the weaving sheds directly beneath the failing stack would still fill each morning with women and girls and children. The warning was read, understood, and answered with a half measure that protected the yard and left the workforce exactly where they had always been. There is a bitter logic to it, and it is worth naming plainly because it is the true cause of what's happened as surely as the made ground and the separating shell. A working mill over Christmas and the days after was revenue. The looms turning meant cloth, and cloth meant money. To stop the mill was to lose all of that, and to lose it at the word of a builder who could not tell you the precise day. Weighed on one side, certain, immediate loss of production. Weighed on the other, a risk that might, for all anyone could prove in advance, hold off another week or another month. The men who made the decision chose to keep the mill running. They bet the difference on the chimney lasting a little longer. The people who paid that bet were not the ones who placed it. In the days right before the collapse, the gales gave one final round of warnings, and they too were absorbed and passed over. The wind was strong enough that it dislodged stone from the chimney and even did damage to the repair scaffolding that had been erected around it, tearing at the very apparatus that had been put up to make the structure safe. A chimney shedding stone in a gale, damaging the scaffolding built to save it, is not a subtle signal, but the pattern held, as it had held since 1865. There was always a repair to make, and always a reason to keep going while it was made. So consider what stood assembled by the morning of the 28th of December. A chimney, built on filled ground over an old mine shaft. A chimney raised too tall for that ground, even after its height was cut. A chimney whose outer shell was made so that it could peel from its core, and which was now visibly doing exactly that. A chimney forced upright in its youth with driven iron, leaving a permanent weakness. A chimney that had cracked and been patched in 1865, and again in 1873, and that through the winter of 1882 was swaying in the wind, dropping stone daily and carrying an open bulge on its southeast face. A chimney inspected days earlier and judged not urgent. And a chimney about which a written warning had been received 8 days before, stating that part of it would be forced out within the week. Every fact was known. Every one of them was on the record before the event, not discovered after it. That is what separates this from a true accident, and it is the thing to hold as the ordinary morning begins. The mill had closed for Christmas on the 22nd of December. For a few days the great sheds stood silent, the engines cold, the looms still. Then on the 27th the workers came back. The winter mornings meant early starts, and the engine was fired up at 6 o'clock to build the head of steam the machinery needed. The routine of the working week resumed as if the season had never paused it. Women and girls and boys came in from Calcutta Street and Parsonage Road and Caledonia Street, through the dark and the cold, into the noise and the warmth of the mill. The morning of the 28th of December was for almost everyone who lived through it, and for the many who did not, a morning like any other. The engine had been running since 6. By 8 o'clock the mill was full and working, something close to 100 people at their places, and at around 8 o'clock, out in the yard, 3 or 4 tons of stone fell from the chimney onto the ground below. Sit with the size of that, not a shower of debris. 3 or 4 tons of masonry, coming away from the stack and crashing down into the yard. It was the loudest warning the chimney had yet given, delivered perhaps 10 minutes before the end. But the people it was meant for could not hear it. They were inside, in the weaving sheds, amid the din of the machinery, and by that hour many of them had stopped for breakfast. They sat together in the sheds with their food, in from the cold, talking, resting for a few minutes before the work resumed. They did not know that the chimney had just shed 3 tons of itself into the yard. They did not know that the thing they had all watched crack for years was in that moment finally letting go. It is here that the small and ordinary decisions of a single morning decided who would live. Susanna Wright, 16, of Calcutta Street, had come to work as she always did, but she had forgotten her cotton, and so she had gone back home to fetch it. That errand, that trivial, exasperating thing of the sort that happens to everyone, took her out of the mill and kept her out of it in the minutes that mattered. Going home for a forgotten reel of cotton is what put a wall of distance between Susanna Wright and what was coming. She lived because of it. And there was James Henry Hancock, 13 years old, the son of the widow Sarah. It was said afterwards that on that morning the boy did not want to go. It was said that he begged his mother, telling her, "Do not let me go this morning. Someone will be killed at that place before breakfast time." Whether a child truly spoke those exact words on that exact morning, or whether grief and hindsight shaped them into their final form, no one can now say for certain. But the answer his mother was said to have given carries the whole weight of the age in it. "The masters," she told him, "know better than such as ye." She was not being careless with her son. She was saying what almost everyone in Bowling believed, and had every reason to believe, that the men who owned the mills and ran them and hired the experts knew what they were doing, and that it was not the place of a widow and her boy to second-guess them. She sent him to work because trusting the masters was the only rational thing a poor woman could do. James Henry Hancock did not come home. By 10 minutes past 8, the mill was working, and the workers were at their breakfast, and the wind was still up. Then a strong gust struck the weakened stack, and the countdown that had been running for 20 years reached its end. The chimney tottered, the bulge on its southeast face gave way, and 255 feet of stone began to move. To the people who saw it fall, and there were people in the surrounding streets who did, it did not come down all at once. One eyewitness described how it seemed to fall in a solid column for some little time, standing and moving as a single great shaft before it broke off at the bottom and fell upon the mill in 2 pieces. That is the image to hold. Not a crumbling, but a tower leaning out of the sky, whole and then breaking near its base and dropping its length across the works. It fell in a southeasterly direction, straight across the centre of Newlands Mill. Close to 4,000 tons of stone came down onto the roofs of the weaving sheds where the workers sat at breakfast. The cornice alone, the decorative crown at the top, weighed something like 50 tons on its own. The falling mass went through a 5-story section of the mill. Witnesses afterwards described the way it had sheared through the building as cleanly as if it had been done with a knife, cutting one end of the works away and levelling it. Roughly 400 square yards of the mill were buried under the debris. Where minutes before there had been floors and looms and people eating, there was now a mountain of broken stone and timber, and above it a great cloud of dust and lime rising into the winter air, so thick that witnesses spoke of an appalling darkness settling over the yard. It was over in seconds. 100 people had come to work that morning. When the dust began to clear, roughly half of them were beneath the stone. 54 people died at Newlands Mill. Of the dead, 41 were female and 13 were male. The average age of those killed was around 18 years. 20 of them were children under the age of 15. The formal cause of death, stated once and plainly, and then left alone, was that most died from the collapse of the masonry upon them. They were, the great majority of them, the women and girls and children of bowling, the half-timers, and the young workers, whose few shillings a week held their families together, gathered in one place at one moment, because it was time for breakfast, and the timing of that ordinary meal is what placed so many of them in the path of the fall. The families that lost more than one child that morning tell the scale of it better than any total can. There were the Burley sisters, Sarah Jane, who was 17, and Lily, who was 14, the daughters of a man named William Burley. There were the Boldy brothers, George, 16, and Joseph, 12, the sons of a blacksmith named Benjamin Boldy, 2 boys from one household gone in the same minute. There was Charles Smith, 58, and his son Arthur, who was 11, father and child, found together. There were the Henderson sisters, Mary and Sarah Jane, the daughters of a woolcomber named James Henderson. A colleague of the family, James Nichols, later recorded what those girls had earned: Mary 7 shillings and 6pence a week, Sarah Jane a half-timer on 3 shillings and 6pence, the small precise wages of children who were helping to keep a home. Remember James Henderson, the father of those 2 girls, because his grief would carry the matter into a courtroom. The response was immediate. Rescue began within moments of the fall. Neighbours and workmen and anyone with hands scrambling onto the debris to dig. The first 6 bodies were recovered within the hour, but the scale of what had come down was such that this could not be the work of minutes, or even of a single day. 400 square yards of collapsed stone had to be lifted and searched by hand, carefully, because no one could know at the start how many were beneath it, or whether any of them were still alive. As the winter afternoon began to fail, the rescuers faced the loss of daylight, and here a detail of the age enters the story that is worth holding. Sir Henry Ripley's nearby dye works had a dynamo, an electrical generator, and from it electric light was brought to the ruins of the mill so that the digging could go on into the darkness. In 1882, electric light was still a marvel, a thing most people had never seen. And so the search for the dead of Newlands Mill was carried out, through the night, under the glow of one of the newest inventions of the era, brought from the works of the very family whose chimney had fallen. The men dug on into the small hours by that strange white light, lifting the stone piece by piece. The following day, the effort grew. Search parties worked in shifts of around 150 men at a time, spelling one another so that the digging never stopped. The dead were carried to a temporary mortuary set up to receive them, and here the cruelty of the disaster showed itself in a new form. By the end of the first day, around 22 bodies lay in the temporary mortuary, with 4 more of the dead at the infirmary, but only 14 of them could be identified by their relatives. The rest could be known, for the moment, only by their clothing, by a familiar pattern of cloth, a mended seam, the tattered garments that a mother or a husband recognised when a face could not serve. Families walked among the recovered, searching for something they knew. The last of the dead would not be recovered from the debris until the 3rd of January, 6 days after the fall. Certain names should be carried out of that darkness, because ordinary people did extraordinary things at Newlands Mill. Sergeant Matthew Laycock was the first police sergeant on the scene, and he directed and shared in the rescue through those first desperate hours. He was later decorated for his conduct, and he went on serving the town for years afterward. A fireman named Samuel Oddie, who worked for Haley and Company, was among those who laboured in the ruins. 2 volunteers whose names the record kept, G. Ainsworth of Caledonia Street and Sam Fearnley of King Charles Street, came to dig alongside the rest, neighbours giving their strength to the work of uncovering neighbours. And out of the stone, more than a day after the fall, came the story that the town would hold on to. A boy named David Charles Brewer, about 10 years old, had been in the mill when it came down, and had been carried into a cellar beneath the debris and trapped there. He was not found in the first hours or the first day. He lay pinned beneath a beam in the dark for more than 30 hours, while the men above him lifted the ruins by hand and by electric light. When at last a joiner working through the wreckage reached him, the boy was still alive. The men raised the beam that pinned him and freed him and gave him brandy and brought him up out of the stone. He had been down there so long, in the dark and out of all sense of time, that when he came up he believed it was still about Tuesday. He had lost the days entirely. David Charles Brewer lived. In a story so heavy with the loss of children, a single child pulled alive from beneath 30 hours of stone was the one piece of grace the town was given, and it seized on it. Later, at a benefit held at Poulan's Theatre of Varieties to raise money for the relief of the bereaved families, the boy was presented with a gold watch by the proprietor, Mr. Pullen, before an audience that had come to give what it could. The survival of one small boy became something people could gather around when there was so little else. Not all of the injured survived. Numbers hurt in the collapse were significant, though the exact count was never cleanly set down. Some of those pulled alive from the ruins did not recover from what the fall had done to them, and in the days that followed, the toll continued quietly to climb. The last to die was a young woman named Grace Ellen Forthrop of Parsonage Road, who had been among the injured and who was helped in her final days by the fireman Samuel Oddie. She died on the 7th or 8th of January 1883, 10 days or so after the chimney fell, and her death closed the ledger of the disaster at 54. Then came the reckoning, and the reckoning is where a tragedy became something that a nation would argue about. The inquest opened on the 29th of December, the day after the collapse, before the Bradford coroner, James G. Hutchinson. This was not a brief formality. The inquest into the deaths at Newlands Mill was adjourned and reconvened many times, at least 15 sittings in all, as the coroner and his jury worked to establish how a chimney could fall on 100 people 3 days after Christmas. They heard from the builders, they heard from steeplejacks, they heard from the mill's agent, they heard from witnesses to the fall and from men who knew the structure. The government took the matter seriously enough to appoint its own examiner, a Lieutenant Colonel Seddon of the Royal Engineers, to investigate the failure and report on why the chimney had come down. And there was a great deal for them to find, because almost nothing about this disaster was hidden. The history of the cracking was known. The repairs of 1865 and 1873 were on the record. The swaying and the falling stone of that final winter had been seen by many. The inspection days before Christmas had happened, and the letter existed. Francis Haley's warning of the 20th of December, carrying the builder Humphrey's prediction that the damaged section would be forced out before the end of the week, was there to be produced and read aloud. 8 days of grace between a written warning and a mass of dead workers. Weigh all of that, and then weigh the verdict. On the 31st of January, 1883, after the many weeks of sittings, the jury deliberated for about 2 hours and returned its finding. In its own words, the jury declared, "We find that the owners did all that non-practical men could reasonably be expected to do under the circumstances, and therefore we do not attach any blame to them or find them guilty of negligence, and give as our verdict accidental death." They went on, "We are of opinion that the foundation was good, and that the fall of the chimney was partly due to the cutting, aided by the strong winds on that morning of the accident." And then, in the same breath, they added one final clause, "And we regret that the works were not stopped during the repairs. Read that verdict slowly, because everything wrong with the age is inside it." The jury found that the foundation was good when the chimney had been raised on the filled shaft of an old mine and cut down in height because the ground could not bear the original design. It found that the owners had done all that could reasonably be expected, and having found no blame and no negligence, it then turned round and said in the very same document that it regretted the works were not stopped during the repairs. The jury conceded the one fact that mattered, that the mill should not have been running while the chimney was being repaired above it, and having conceded it, attached the responsibility for it to no one. It said in effect that the thing which should have been done was not done, and that nobody was to blame for not doing it. That contradiction did not slip past the country. When the verdict was reported, the national press turned on it with a force that is startling to read even now. The Birmingham Daily Mail called it the old story, nobody to blame, a chimney known to be in an unsafe condition and actually undergoing repair, and yet a finding that held no one to account. The Globe was blunt. "A more unsatisfactory finding," it wrote, "has rarely been arrived at in a court of law." The Illustrated London News, one of the most widely read publications in the land, went furthest of all. It expressed the hope that the relatives of the dead might yet recover large pecuniary damages, and it named the thing directly. This, the paper wrote, was a case of culpable mismanagement, of no unforeseen accident, but somebody's shameful want of care. That phrase deserves to stand on its own. No unforeseen accident, but somebody's shameful want of care. A national newspaper, reading the same evidence the jury had read, arrived at the plain conclusion that a coroner's jury in Bradford could not bring itself to reach. The evidence pointed one way, the verdict went the other, and the gap between them is the true scandal of Newlands Mill. Why did the jury flinch? The record does not let us climb inside the minds of 12 men, but the shape of the thing is not hard to see. The owners were the Ripleys. Sir Henry Ripley, the founder of the model village, the philanthropist, the man who had handed a golden key to the Prince of Wales, had died only weeks before, in November of 1882, and the works had passed to his heirs. To find the Ripley family guilty of negligence in the deaths of 54 people was to indict the most respected name in that corner of Bradford, a name attached to good housing and good works and civic pride. It was one thing for a London paper to write the word culpable. It was another for 12 local men in a town the Ripleys had shaped to write it in a verdict. The good name that had made the disaster harder to imagine now made the blame harder to assign. The jury softened, and the phrase "nobody to blame" passed into the record as the official truth of what had happened. But the families did not accept that the matter was closed, and one of them took it further than a coroner's court could go. In 1884, James Henderson, the wool-combing father who had lost his 2 daughters, Mary and Sarah Jane, brought a civil action for damages. The The case Henderson against Sir Edward Ripley and others came before Justice Manistee at the Leeds Summer Assizes. Here was a bereaved father asking a court of law to do what the inquest had refused to do, to place the loss of his children at the door of the people who owned the mill. The Ripley firm had already made some provision to the affected families, paying funeral expenses and 7 weeks' wages by way of compensation. 7 weeks' wages. For a half-timer earning 3 shillings and 6pence a week, set against the loss of a daughter, the figure speaks for itself about how the age valued the lives of its working children against the cost of a stopped mill. What made the verdict so bitter was not only what it did to the Ripley's account, but what it revealed about the law itself. Because in truth, the coroner's jury had not simply failed. It had reflected faithfully enough the state of a country that had not yet decided such a death was a crime. Consider the framework the age actually had. Victorian factory legislation was not nothing. Across the middle decades of the century, Parliament had passed a series of factory acts that policed the hours people could be made to work, that limited the labour of women and children, that set down the half-time system under which children like the Boldy brothers and the Henderson sisters split their days between the mill and the school. The law had learned to care about how long a child might be worked and at what age a child might begin. What the law had not learned to care about was whether the building the child was worked in might fall down. There was, in 1882, no effective structural safety inspectorate for industrial chimneys. There was no legal requirement that a stack known to be defective be surveyed, condemned, and taken down before it could be allowed to stand over a working floor. There was no inspector whose job it was to arrive at Newlands Mill, read the history of cracking and repair, look at the bulge on the southeast face, and order the mill closed until the danger was gone. The power that would have saved 54 lives, the simple authority to say this structure is unsafe and no one shall work beneath it, did not exist in any enforceable form. The gap in the law was not a technicality, it was the space through which the disaster walked, and this is where Newlands Mill matters beyond Bradford, beyond the 54 graves and the softened verdict. The disaster became one of the cases the country pointed to when it argued, through the closing decades of the 19th century, about the duty an employer owes to the people who work for him. The phrase the newspapers had thrown at the verdict, "nobody to blame," hardened into a kind of accusation against the whole system. It was the old story, the Birmingham paper had said, and it was old precisely because it kept happening. A structure fails, workers die, an inquiry finds the owners did all that reasonable men could do, and no one answers for it. Newlands became a byword for that pattern, a case cited in the growing campaign for stronger duties on employers and for independent inspection of the buildings that working people were made to labour in. That campaign was already moving. Only 2 years before the chimney fell, Parliament had passed the Employers' Liability Act of 1880, a first real attempt to make it possible for an injured worker, or the family of a dead one, to recover damages from an employer whose negligence had caused the harm. It was a limited measure, hedged with restrictions, and the Henderson family's own suit in 1884 shows how hard the road to compensation still was. But it marked the direction the country was travelling, away from the idea that a workplace death was simply the worker's misfortune, and toward the idea that the person who owned the workplace bore responsibility for its safety. From that beginning ran a line, through the factory reforms and the workmen's compensation laws of the decades that followed, toward the framework we now take entirely for granted. Because here is the thing that connects a Bradford chimney in 1882 to the world you move through today. The principle that eventually won is the exact principle that Newlands Mill was managed in defiance of. Today, a structure known to be unsafe over people's heads must be condemned and the workplace stopped. That is not a courtesy, it is the law. If an industrial chimney or a wall or a floor or a roof is found to be failing, the modern requirement is that it be surveyed by competent people, that the area be cordoned off, and that the workers be removed until it is made safe or brought down. The production stops. The revenue is lost. And it is lost because the law now says, without argument, that the life of the person underneath is worth more than the output of the machine. Every time a site is closed because a survey found a structure unsound, every time work halts and people are sent out from under something that might fall, you are watching the exact decision that Francis Haley's letter asked for on the 20th of December, 1882, and that the management of Newlands Mill declined to make. The step they refused is now the step the law compels. That is the legacy, and it was paid for in Bowling. It would be too neat, and it would not be true, to say that one Act of Parliament was passed in answer to Newlands Mill and fixed the matter. The country did not work that way, and reform came not from a single disaster, but from the accumulating weight of many, each one adding its dead to the argument, until the pattern of nobody to blame became something the public would no longer tolerate. Newlands was one of those cases. Its power lay in how plainly it made the point. Here was no mystery, no hidden flaw discovered only in the wreckage. Here was a chimney watched for 20 years, patched twice, swaying and shedding stone, inspected days before, and named in a written warning 8 days before, and still the verdict was accidental death, and nobody to blame. If that was an accident, then the word had lost its meaning, and the country slowly came to agree that it had. For a long time, the memory of Newlands Mill was kept in the most fragile way imaginable. The first act of commemoration was a stone, taken from the fallen chimney itself, set up near the site as a marker of what had happened there. A piece of the very thing that had killed them, stood up to remember the dead. But it was an unmarked stone carrying no names, and in the way of such things, it was in time lost altogether, so that for years there was nothing at the place to tell a passer-by that 54 people had died on that ground. The disaster slipped toward the condition that so many working-class tragedies of the century slipped toward, remembered in local histories and family memory, but unmarked in the streets where it happened. The sort of event a town carries quietly, and the wider country forgets. The dead themselves were gathered, many of them, into Undercliff Cemetery, the great Victorian burial ground that rises on a hill above Bradford. It is a place built in the confident manner of the age, with its terraces and its grand monuments to the mill owners and the merchants who made the town, the very class whose wealth the weaving sheds of Newlands had helped to build. Among those monuments lie the people from the bottom of that same economy, the girls and boys of Bowling. The Boldy brothers are there, George and Joseph, the blacksmith's sons. The Burley sisters, Sarah Jane and Lily, are there. They were buried in the winter of 1882 and 1883, and the town that buried them went back to work. It took 120 years for the place to be properly marked again. In 2002, on the anniversary of the disaster, a new memorial stone was raised near the site of the mill, and this one carried the names of the victims, so that the 54 were no longer an anonymous total, but a list of individual people, each with a name that a visitor could read and a family that had once answered to it. A plaque was set up. The community that still lived in that corner of Bradford, and the descendants of those who had been lost, came together to insist that what had happened there would have a marker that named the dead and would not be lost a second time. The mill itself is largely gone from the shape it held in 1882. The Newlands and Ripley works, the great manufacturing estate that had dominated Bowling, has been overtaken by the redevelopment of the district, and the forest of chimneys that once defined the Bradford skyline has thinned to almost nothing. The worsted trade that built the town long since departed. The soot-blackened certainties of Worstedopolis, the model village, the technical college opened with a golden key, all of it belongs now to a vanished century. What remains, At the ground where the chimney fell is the stone raised in 2002 and the names upon it. The names on that stone are worth dwelling on, because a list of the dead is not a statistic but a gathering of households. Behind each name stands a street, a doorway, a family that set a place at the table for someone who did not come back to it. Charles Smith and his boy Arthur, 58 and 11, a man and his son who had walked to the mill together and were found together beneath the stone. The Henderson girls, Mary and Sarah Jane, whose small wages their father had recorded down to the shilling, and whose loss drove that father into a courtroom 2 years later to demand that someone answer for it. There were others whose names the record kept, ordinary people of Bowling. A young woman named Lavinia Cooper, who was 19, a woman named Selina Woodhead, 32, and her daughter Susan, mother and child lost in the same instant, Ellen Lum, Urena, and Walter Hicks. Each of them had woken in the dark that morning, dressed against the cold, and gone into work as they had gone in 1,000 mornings before. The town, whatever the coroner's jury had failed to do, did not fail its dead in the matter of feeling. The response of the ordinary people of Bradford was immediate and generous. A relief fund was raised for the families who had lost their earners and their children, and money came in from across the town and beyond it. The benefit at Poulin's Theatre of Varieties, where the boy David Brewer was given his gold watch, was one gathering among many. The people of the district giving what they had to those the disaster had left without. There is a truth in that worth holding alongside the failure of the verdict. The same society that could not bring itself to name a guilty party could weep, and give, and fill a theatre to raise a few pounds for a bereaved mother. The compassion of the crowd and the caution of the court sat side by side in the same town, in the same weeks, and both were real. The funerals themselves became a procession of grief through the streets of Bowling that winter. Household after household carried its dead up the hill to Undercliff or to the other burial grounds of the district in the short, cold days at the turn of the year. For a community bound together by the mills, where the same families had worked the same sheds for a generation, there was scarcely a street in that part of Bradford untouched. A disaster that takes 54 people from a single small quarter of a town does not fall on strangers. It falls on neighbours, on the children of neighbours, on the girl who lived 3 doors down, and the boys whose father shod horses at the end of the row. The whole of Bowling was in mourning at once, and the ones who lived carried it with them. David Charles Brewer, the boy pulled from beneath the beam after more than 30 hours in the dark, went on into a life that the 54 were denied, carrying for the rest of it the memory of a cellar under the stone and the strangeness of coming up into the light, believing that days had not passed. Susanna Wright, who had gone home for a forgotten reel of cotton, lived out the whole of a life that turned on that one small errand, on the sheer accident of having stepped out of the mill in the minutes before it fell. There is no reason and no justice in why one girl was inside and another was on the road home. There is only the ordinary randomness of a morning, and the fact that the thing which decided it was never the workers to control. What they could control, none of it mattered. The one decision that could have saved every one of them belonged to men who were not in the sheds at all. It is worth staying a moment with that helplessness, because it is the quiet centre of the whole story. The women and girls and children who filled the weaving sheds of Newlands Mill had no way to read a foundation, no means to measure a lean, no standing to demand that an engine be left cold. They could not have known that the ground beneath the stack was made up earth over an old shaft, or that the outer shell had been built so that it might one day peel from its core, or that a builder had written down, 8 days before, the very week the thing would fail. That knowledge lived entirely with the men who owned and managed the works, the men who held the letter and read the inspection and weighed the cost of a stopped mill against the risk of a standing one. The people beneath the chimney carried the whole of the danger and none of the information. They came in from the cold each morning and gave their labour on the plain, reasonable faith that someone above them had made sure the roof would hold. That faith was the only protection they had, and at Newlands Mill it was the one thing that failed them completely. And that faith was not naive. It was built into the whole arrangement of their lives, reinforced every ordinary day the chimney did not fall. 20 years is a long time for a warning to go unanswered, and to the people of Bowling, those 20 years read not as a countdown, but as reassurance. Every morning the stack still stood was, in a quiet way, evidence that the masters had it in hand. The cracks had been patched before and the mill had gone on. The steeplejacks had climbed it and come down, and the looms had kept turning. Familiarity did to that chimney what it does to every danger a person lives beside long enough. It made it ordinary. The sway in the wind became a thing you stopped noticing, the fall of stone into the yard a nuisance to step around rather than a summons to run. The very length of the warning, the 2 decades of it, is what drained it of its force, so that by the winter of 1882 the most dangerous structure in Bowling had become simply part of the skyline, a fixed and unremarkable fact of the place, right up until the 10 minutes in which it ceased to be. And so the last thing to hold before the ground where they lie is how completely undramatic that final morning was meant to be. No one walked into Newlands Mill on the 28th of December expecting anything but a working Thursday. The kettle warmth of the sheds after the cold walk-in, the few minutes of breakfast, the talk, the ordinary business of 100 people settling to their food before the machinery called them back. It was, until the gust struck the bulge, one of the most ordinary mornings imaginable, and that is precisely what makes it unbearable. The disaster did not announce itself. It arrived inside a routine, in the gap between one mouthful and the next, and it took its 54 out of the middle of the most commonplace hour of the working week. Look hard at the arithmetic of who was taken, because it is the coldest and truest measure of the thing. 54 dead, and 41 of them female. An average age of around 18, which is to say that for every grown woman among the dead, there was a girl to pull the average down, and that the heart of the loss fell on the young. 20 of the 54 had not yet reached their 15th birthday. These were the half-timers and the child workers of Bowling, the ones whose 3 and 6pence and their few extra shillings were stitched into the household budget, sent out to the mill not from cruelty, but from need, because in a poor family every earner counted, and a child old enough to stand at a frame was a child old enough to help keep the rent paid. The mill had drawn them in for exactly the reason it drew in their mothers and their older sisters, because the worsted trade ran on cheap and willing hands, and the cheapest and most willing were the youngest. And so when the stack came down at 10 minutes past 8, it came down on a workforce weighted toward women and girls and children, and the toll it left carried that same weighting exactly. The disaster did not choose. It simply fell on whoever was beneath it, and whoever was beneath it that morning was the young of a working district at their breakfast. There is one more thing the numbers hold that is easy to pass over. 100 people, more or less, were in the mill when it fell, and 54 of them died. That is not the edge of a disaster. That is very nearly its centre of mass, a little over half of everyone present, gone in the space of seconds. To be in Newlands Mill at 8 o'clock that morning was to have something close to an even chance of not leaving it. The survivors were not spared by any margin of safety, because there was none. They were spared by where they happened to be standing, by which end of which shed they had chosen, by an errand or a delay or a step in one direction rather than another. Between the living and the dead, there was often no more distance than a few feet of floor, and nothing a person did or failed to do had earned them either side of it. And for the families of Bowling, that terrible arithmetic did not resolve in a single morning. When a mill falls, the counting of the dead is not the work of an hour, but of days, and in the gap between the collapse and the last body lifted, there was a whole population of people who did not yet know which side of the line their own belonged to, a mother whose daughter had gone into work that Thursday, and who now stood at the edge of the ruined yard, while men she knew lifted the stone by hand, was not yet a bereaved woman, and not yet a lucky one. She was something in between, held there for hours and then for days in the worst suspense a person can be asked to bear, watching the slow shifting of a mountain of stone for the one face or the one scrap of familiar cloth that would end the not knowing one way or the other. The last of the dead was not brought out until the 3rd of January, 6 days after the fall. For some households that meant 6 days of standing and waiting and hoping against the growing likelihood, 6 days measured out in shifts of digging men and failing winter light, before they were finally handed the certainty that the collapse had made of their family. And even certainty, when it came, was often a poor and partial thing. To recognise your own, not by a face but by a garment, by the pattern of a dress you had mended, or the cut of a jacket you had watched go out the door that morning, is to be given back your dead in the hardest possible form. 14 of them at first could be known cleanly by their relatives. The rest were identified slowly, by their clothing, by the small and intimate marks that only a family carries in its memory, so that the act of claiming the dead became its own long ordeal laid on top of the loss itself. This was the texture of the days that followed the fall. Not a single moment of catastrophe, but a slow, grinding aftermath that spread the disaster out across a fortnight of Bradford's winter and touched before it was done nearly every street in Bowling. And behind the grief there ran, for the households of Bowling, a harder and more practical reckoning, because in a working district the dead had not only been loved, they had been relied upon. The economy of these families was built on the pooling of many small wages, and the wages of women and children were not pin money but structural, part of the sum that met the rent and bought the bread each week. A mother killed in that mill was a household's keeper gone. A working daughter killed was 3 and 6pence or 7 and 6 a week, struck out of a budget that had no slack in it to begin with. A family that had walked several earners to the same gate that morning could lose, in a single collapse, not one person but 2, and with them a large part of everything that had kept the household solvent. This is the part of a disaster that does not end when the digging ends. The grief and the poverty arrived together and stayed together, and a home that had lost a child to the stone could find itself, in the same stroke, unable to meet the week that followed. That is the need the relief fund was raised against, and it is why the giving mattered so plainly, and so much. The money gathered from across Bradford and beyond was not a gesture. For families suddenly short of the earners who had held them together, it was, for a time, the thing that stood between them and the workhouse. There is a particular cruelty in that, when you set it beside the 7 weeks' wages the Ripley firm offered by way of compensation. 7 weeks, and then the ledger, in the firm's reckoning, was closed. For the loss of a child who might have earned for years, for the loss of a mother on whom a whole household turned, 7 weeks' wages and the cost of the funeral was the measure the owners set. It was not nothing, and it was offered before any court had compelled a penny, but weighed against a lifetime of the earnings that were gone, and against the grief that no sum could touch, it stated with brutal clarity how the age priced the life of a working woman or a working child, which was cheaply, and how it priced the running of a mill, which was dear. It is worth asking why a town would wait 120 years, and then at last cut 54 names into a stone. The answer is that a name is the one thing a disaster of this kind tries to take. When 54 people die in the same 10 minutes, in the same place, the natural pull of memory is toward the number, because the number is what is staggering, and the number is what fits into a headline and a verdict and a line in a history book. But a number is precisely what these people were not. Sarah Jane Burley was 17 and had a younger sister she went to work beside. Joseph Boldy was 12 and had a brother of 16 and a father who worked iron. Arthur Smith was 11 and walked to the mill with his own father. Each of them was a particular child in a particular house, on a particular street. with a place at a table and a sound to their step on the stair, and the collapse did not only end their lives, it threatened, over the decades that followed, to dissolve them into a single, anonymous total. 54, a figure to be recited without a face behind it. To carve the names is to refuse that. It is to insist, against the flattening pull of the number, that the disaster happened to individuals and not to a statistic, and that each of those individuals is owed the small permanence of a name a stranger can still read on a stone. That refusal is the last act of the story, and it belongs not to the coroner or the courts, or the Ripleys, but to the ordinary descendants and neighbours who would not let the thing be forgotten. The unmarked stone from the chimney had been the first attempt, and it had failed, lost like so much else to time and redevelopment, so that for the better part of a century the ground gave up nothing of what had happened on it. It took the deliberate work of people in the present, generations removed from the fall, to bring the names back into the daylight and fix them where the mill had stood. In doing so, they did what the verdict had never managed. They gave the disaster a settled and honest account of itself, one that begins not with an owner exonerated but with the people who are lost, listed and named and placed at the centre where they belong. Stand for a moment in the place where most of them lie, because Undercliff Cemetery says something the rest of the story cannot. It is a Victorian burial ground of the grand kind, laid out on its hill above Bradford in the full confidence of the age that built it, and its great avenue is lined with the heavy monuments of the men who made the town, the manufacturers and the merchants and the mill owners, obelisks and draped urns and carved names raised high to declare that these were people of consequence who had left a mark. It is in stone a portrait of the very order that ran the worsted trade, wealth memorialising itself in granite. And into that same ground, in the winter of 1882 and the early days of 1883, were carried the girls and boys of Bowling, the half-timers and the young weavers, the people from the bottom of the economy whose labour had helped raise the fortunes the great monuments commemorate. They did not, most of them, get obelisks. They got the plain burial of the working poor, but they lie on the same hill under the same Yorkshire sky, and the nearness of the two is its own quiet argument. The wealth of Bradford and the price of that wealth are buried within sight of each other, and anyone who walks that cemetery now walks between them. The town those children were carried up from is largely unrecognisable today. The worsted trade that had made Bradford the busiest wool town on earth drained away across the 20th century, and with it went the forest of chimneys that had once stood over every district until the skyline that a Victorian would have known, dense with stacks and dark with their smoke, thinned to almost nothing. Ripleyville, the model village, and the technical college opened with a golden key, and the great manufacturing estate at Bowling, all of it belongs now to a century that has closed. The ground where Newlands Mill stood has been overtaken by the redevelopment of the district, its sheds and its yards long gone, so that a person standing there today would find little to tell them that anything had ever risen on that spot at all, let alone fallen from it. What is left is the stone raised in the present, and the names upon it, and the graves on the hill, and the memory carried forward by the people who refused to let it go. Carry the principle forward into the ordinary present, because that is where the 54 still count for something. The rule that grew slowly and against resistance out of cases like this one is now so woven into the working world that we barely see it. A crack opens in a wall, a surveyor is called, the ground floor is taped off, and the people are moved out while the thing is assessed. A structure over a workplace is found to be moving, and the site is closed. The workers stood down. The loss of the day's output simply accepted as the cost of not gambling with lives. It happens quietly, thousands of times, in places no one will ever write a history of, and it happens because somewhere behind it stands the hard-won conviction that a known danger over a person's head is not a risk to be managed around, but a reason to stop. That conviction did not exist at Newlands Mill. The letter came, the danger was known, and the answer was to keep people away from the foot of the stack and let the looms run. The distance between that answer and the one the law now demands is the exact distance the country travelled in the decades after, and it was a distance measured in disasters, of which this was one of the plainest and hardest to explain away. That is why the case kept being reached for, long after the rubble was cleared and the fund was spent. It was useful to the reformers precisely because it was so clean. There was no fog of the unforeseen to hide behind, no sudden hidden failure that no one could have predicted. There was a chimney watched for 20 years, patched in 1865 and again in 1873, swaying and shedding stone through a whole winter, inspected in the days before it fell, and named in a written warning 8 days out, and at the end of all of it, a verdict that found the owners had done all that reasonable men could do and attached blame to no one. Held up in the light, that verdict made the argument for reform better than any speech could, because it showed, in a single Bradford courtroom, exactly how the old system worked and exactly whom it failed. Every reformer who wanted to say that the law must change had only to point and describe, and the case did the rest. There is one image from those first days that holds the whole contradiction of the age in a single frame, and it deserves to be seen plainly. Through the night after the fall, the men digging in the ruins worked by electric light, drawn from a dynamo at the Ripley dye works close by and carried to the wreckage so the search need not stop when the winter dark came down. In 1882, that was something close to a wonder. Most people alive had never seen electric light at all. It was the frontier of what the age could do, the very edge of its cleverness. And here was that brand new marvel, brought from the works of the family whose chimney had just fallen, pressed into service to help lift the stone off the bodies of the children that Chimney had killed. The same generation that could summon light out of a wire and pour it over a Bradford yard at midnight could not, or would not, take down a stack it had watched crack for 20 years before it fell on 100 people at their breakfast. All the ingenuity in the world had gone into the one, and none of the resolve into the other. The era's brilliance and the era's blindness stood in that yard together, under the same white glare, and the light that made the rescue possible was a light that need never have been called for at all. And in that yard, through those hours, the ordinary people of Bowling did what the coroner's court would not. They dug for one another. Neighbours came off their own shifts and onto the stone. Firemen and policemen and volunteers, whose names the record barely kept, worked in the cold and the strange electric glare, lifting masonry by hand in the hope of a living voice beneath it. And now and then, as with the boy in the cellar, that hope was answered. Whatever the verdict would later fail to do, the response of the district in those first hours was not indifference. It was the opposite. It was a whole community throwing its strength at a mountain of stone to pull its own out from under it, and refusing, for as long as there was any chance, to stop. It was not only Bradford that grieved. News of the fall travelled fast along the wires that were knitting the country together in those years, and within days the disaster at Newlands Mill was being read about in towns and cities that had never heard of Bowling. The illustrated papers of the period, which reached into parlours the length of the land, carried the story of the chimney that had fallen on a mill full of women and children 3 days after Christmas, and for a while the private catastrophe of one Yorkshire district became a public event that a whole nation followed. That reach mattered. It meant that when the verdict came, the outrage was not confined to the streets around the mill, but rose in newspapers printed hundreds of miles away, so that the finding of nobody to blame was argued over at breakfast tables across the country. A local tragedy had become a national one, not because the dead of Bradford were more numerous or more important than the dead of any other industrial accident, but because this particular fall was so plainly foretold, so thoroughly warned against, that people who would never see the sight could still grasp exactly what had gone wrong and exactly why it enraged them. And that wider attention is part of why the case did not simply sink, as so many workplace deaths of the century sank into the local memory and no further. A disaster read about across the land leaves a longer echo than one buried in a single town's grief. The name Newlands and the phrase that had attached itself to the verdict travelled with the story into the ongoing national argument about who was responsible when a working place killed the people inside it. The 54 of Bradford became, without anyone intending it, part of a much larger accounting that the country was slowly being forced to make with itself, an accounting about the value of a labouring life and the duty of the men who profited from it. The reach of the news carried them into that reckoning, and kept them there long after the yard was cleared. For the families themselves, that larger national reckoning was cold comfort in the short term, because the law, as it actually stood in the 1880s, offered them a hard and narrow road. To seek redress in a court was to take on people of wealth and standing, with all the advantages that money and position brought to a Victorian courtroom, and to do it from the far side of grief and poverty. The compensation the firm had offered came without a fight, and to reach for more meant a suit, and a suit meant expense and delay, and the real possibility of coming away with nothing after months of it. That any bereaved parent from Bowling was willing to walk that road at all is a measure of how deeply the verdict had failed them, how badly they needed a court to say the plain thing the inquest would not. They were not litigious people. They were working people who had lost children, asking the only institution that might compel an answer to place the loss where it belonged. The very difficulty of that road is part of the indictment, a system in which a grieving father must mount a costly civil action 2 years on, simply to have the deaths of his daughters weighed honestly, is a system that has already decided, in every practical way, whose losses it will make easy to ignore. That imbalance between the people who owned the mills and the people who worked in them ran through every part of this story from the ground up, and it did not end at the cemetery gate or the courtroom door. It was there in the made ground that no worker chose to build on. In the letter, no worker was shown. In the decision, no worker was consulted about. And in the verdict that no working juror sat comfortably enough in that town to overturn. The people who bore the entire weight of the danger had, at every stage, the least say in it, and the least power to demand an answer afterwards. To understand Newlands Mill is finally to understand that the long structural distance between those who took the risk and those who paid for it, a distance that the century would spend its remaining decades, disaster by disaster, slowly and incompletely trying to close. And yet, for all that structural weight, the thing itself, when it came, was astonishingly small in duration. 20 years of warning, 2 decades of cracks and patches and inspections, and one written prophecy of the end, and then the whole of it discharged in a matter of seconds on a Thursday morning. That is the strange proportion at the centre of this story. The causes stretched across a generation. The event lasted less than a minute. Everything that mattered had already been decided long before the gust struck the bulge, decided in the choice of ground and the manner of building, in the answer to the letter and the running of the engine, so that by 10 minutes past 8 there was nothing left to decide, and nothing left to do but fall. The people at their breakfast were living inside a conclusion that had been reached without them, over years, in rooms they never entered. They just did not know it yet. The chimney did. It had been telling anyone who would look for 20 years exactly how this would end. And on the 28th of December, 1882, it finished the sentence. What remained after that, when the stone was lifted and the dead were named and the verdict was argued over and the fund was gathered and spent, was the plain shape of what had happened, and it has not changed with the years. A structure known to be failing was left standing over the people who worked beneath it, because stopping cost money and the danger could not name its hour. That is the whole of it, stripped to the bone. Everything else, the philanthropy and the good name, the electric light and the newspapers, the courtroom and the compensation, gathers around that single fact without altering it. They knew, and they did not stop. And 54 people who trusted them to know better did not come home. It is worth resisting the temptation to soften that into something more comfortable, because the age itself spent a great deal of effort softening it, and the softening is part of what the 54 were owed better than. The verdict softened it into an accident. The compensation softened it into a debt settled in 7 weeks' wages. The good name of the owners softened it in the minds of 12 local men who could not quite bring themselves to write the harder word. Even memory, left to itself, softened it, letting the unmarked stone be lost and the disaster fade toward a line in a local history. At every stage there was a pull toward making the thing smaller and more bearable than it was, toward calling it fate or misfortune or the sad price of an industrial age. And at every stage that pull was wrong, because this was not fate. It was a decision, or rather, a long chain of decisions, each one defensible on its own, and catastrophic in some, made by people who had the power to choose otherwise, and the knowledge to know they should. To hold the story honestly is to keep refusing that softening, the way the newspapers refused it in 1883, and the way the community refused it again in 2002. It is to say, plainly and without the comfort of calling it an accident, that the chimney was watched, and the warning was written, and the mill was run, and the people paid. That is the account the stone on the hill now keeps, and it is the account that matters, because it is the only one that is true. Think for a moment about what the phrase half-timer actually meant in the life of a child, because it tells you how ordinary these young workers' lives had been right up to the morning they ended. A half-timer split the day in two. Part of it was spent at school, at letters and sums in a classroom, in the business of being a child and learning. The other part was spent in the mill, at a frame or a loom in the business of earning. The same girl who sat at a desk in the morning might stand in the noise and lint of the weaving shed in the afternoon, or the other way about. Her days permanently divided between the two worlds. The age had decided a working child should inhabit at once. It was exhausting, and it was normal, and to the families it was simply how a household with children got by. The Boldy boys and the Henderson girls and the others lived that divided life, a few shillings at the end of the week to show for it. The school and the mill folded together into a single routine. That is the ordinariness the collapse fell upon. Not idlers, not strangers to work, but children carrying a share of the adult world already, caught at the mill end of a life that had been split down the middle since they were small. And it is worth remembering that this divided childhood was not an abuse hidden in the shadows, but a thing the law itself had built and blessed. The great factory acts of the century, the very laws that stand to the age's credit for limiting the hours and ages of working children, were the laws that set the half-time system in place, that said in effect a child of a certain age may be worked, provided the schooling is not wholly abandoned. The reform and the exposure sat inside the same statutes. The country had taught itself to care that a child not be worked too many hours, and had not yet taught itself to care whether the building that child was sent into might come down. That gap between the hours the law counted and the roof it did not is where the children of Newlands Mill were standing when the chimney fell.